Marijuana, the assassin of youth, the scourge of our country, is reaching out like a mad killer, mowing down the youth of our land, distorting their minds and leading them into lives of degradation and crime.
Calling all cars, calling all cars.
Come on down, Gate. Let's smoke a little tea this evening, huh? Dream out reaper, 5 feet long, the mighty myth, but not too strong. You get high, but not for long. Why, man? 'Cause you's the viper.
2012 was a pivotal election year for many reasons. Since 1996, 16 states in the District of Columbia have voted to legalize medical marijuana. This trend continues today in many of the headlines we see. Many states are considering initiatives allowing medical use of marijuana, but this is in direct opposition to federal law, which says marijuana has no medical value.
'Cause you's the viper.
Marijuana wasn't always illegal in the United States. In fact, it was once a widely prescribed medicine. History has shown that throughout the world, marijuana, or cannabis as it was once known, is one of the oldest forms of medicine. To better understand how marijuana changed from an accepted form of medicine to an illegal drug, we need to look back at the early 20th century. People were familiar with alcohol, drugs, and other addictions. But there was a lot of confusion about the use of the terms when it came to marijuana. Both hemp and marijuana are members of the cannabis family. Industrial hemp was grown for its fiber to be used in clothing and rope, but medical marijuana was grown for its flowering buds, and people didn't understand the differences. So most people called marijuana by its slang terms, such as Indian hemp or Mexican hemp. Hemp agriculture was well known. However, you cannot get high smoking industrial hemp. This caused a lot of misinformation to be in the media. Since this was the era of yellow journalism, reports of Mexicans and blacks exhibiting outrageous behaviors were common in the mass media.
So when we look at propaganda, what we're looking at is an appeal via emotion to change somebody's mind about something. So propaganda really relies on things like fear, anxiety, wishful thinking in order to change public opinion. The problem is that in the absence of science, propaganda is usually relying on some kind of moralistic idea about people and cultures in society. And this was very evident in the formation of marijuana laws. So marijuana laws were primarily designed as a way to control Mexican immigrants. A lot of immigrants came into the United States through Texas, through other port cities like New Orleans, and they brought with them marijuana because this was a plant that had been used for thousands of years in their culture. It was used quite frequently, both as a way to relax and as a medicine, made into various preparations like tinctures and salves and oils. And when these individuals came into the United States, there was a lot of suspicion there. Not only were they going to take jobs that Americans had, but they had a different culture, they had a different language, they looked different, their customs were different. And in the early 1900s, this was a point of fear for most Americans, were individuals coming from outside the country and immigrating into the United States. So El Paso, Texas was actually the first city in the United States to pass a marijuana law in 1914. And the purpose of this law wasn't really about the marijuana. It was an idea that they could keep tabs on the Mexicans that were coming into the country. If they made marijuana illegal, then that gave them the right to stop, search, detain any Mexican that they thought perhaps was using marijuana. And because the rest of the country at the time really had not even heard about marijuana, it was very easy for them to use propaganda to convince the rest of the country that this new drug made Mexicans violent and made so that they couldn't be controlled, and that they were going after white women and that they were raping them. And it was very easy to push this agenda forward because the rest of the country really had nothing else to go on.
Most states had already passed some type of law about marijuana as well, but the states were pushing hard for a new national law, and this became the Uniform States Narcotics Act, which expanded the powers of the federal government. And this expansion included the Treasury Department. The role of the Treasury Department regarding enforcement of prohibition laws changed in 1933. The Treasury Department had split its control into two different departments: the Prohibition Bureau that controlled alcohol, and the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, headed by Harry Jacob Anslinger.
Have you ever met Reefer man.
Born in Altoona, Pennsylvania, May 20th in 1892, the eighth of 9 children in a Swiss immigrant family. At the age of 12, he was sent by a neighbor to pick up a package of morphine from the drugstore. Anslinger said he never forgot the screams of agony shrieked by the neighbor's wife because of her withdrawal symptoms, or how good she felt once she got a dose, or how easy it was for a 12-year-old boy to buy morphine. This was a memory that stuck with him.
Have you ever met this funny reefer man?
Anslinger started his government career in the U.S. Army as assistant to the Chief of Inspection of Equipment. From there, he worked for the U.S. Department of State as a diplomat. Anslinger then transferred to the Alcohol Prohibition Unit of the Department of Treasury, which was given the task of enforcing the drug and alcohol laws. In July of 1930, the Department of Treasury created a new department, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. As commissioner, he participated in international discussions on how to control the illegal flow of narcotics. Anslinger's annual reports to the U.S. Treasury Department were also submitted as the official positions of the U.S. government to the League of Nations Opium Advisory Committee. Early on in his career as the head of the Bureau, Anslinger faced a lot of internal problems, such as scandal and corruption. His career was almost cut short. In a memo to field officers, Harry warned his men to be on the lookout for an informant that he is suspected of using him. In his description of the gentleman, he used a racial slur. Now, a few senators called for Anslinger's resignation, but this should show you the power he had in his office. If you wanted to talk about drug control, you had to talk to Harry. If your company wanted to be in the pharmaceutical business, you had to talk to Harry. He wrote the reports to Congress about the drug use in America, and he was the one that attended the international conventions. With this position, he was an expert on drugs and their effects on people. When Anslinger needed help, here came the drug companies. When they needed help, Anslinger wrote a report. So when Anslinger first started calling marijuana a narcotic and insisting that it be controlled like any other narcotic, nobody questioned him. There was a lot of confusion going on in America. While Anslinger's first reports were calling marijuana nothing more than a nuisance, the media was making other claims. This was really important to Anslinger. If he wanted to increase his budget and manpower, he had to make a change. Anslinger first claimed Indian hemp was not dangerous, and its uses did not lead to addiction or the use of harder drugs, such as opium or heroin. But most people had never heard of marijuana, since it was a slang term from cannabis that came from Mexican immigrants.
So the word cannabis had existed for thousands of years. It was well known as a medical ingredient. Companies like Bayer and Eli Lilly all had cannabis in their medications back before it was made illegal. So the United States was very familiar with the idea of cannabis. However, they'd never heard of marijuana. So that was very sneaky on the part of the federal government to say, you know what, this isn't cannabis. This medicine that all of you know in the rest of the country as being this fairly benign substance, that's not what this is. This is something different. This is marijuana, and this is dangerous. And because the rest of the country really didn't have any information to disprove that, the propaganda was extremely successful.
By 1935, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had done an effective job of controlling the spread of narcotics, but there was a new drug that became the focus of the media's attention. Newspaper headlines were talking about the horrors of marijuana, everything from axe murderers and insanity to sexual deviance. Finally, enough political pressure was put upon the federal government to control this new menace, and it fell on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. However, Anslinger was cautious in his approach to dealing with the new threat. He knew of the drug and had written reports about it and thought it was more of a nuisance, even saying that it grew like dandelions along the roads. In 1936, Anslinger disclosed that 50% of violent crimes committed in districts occupied by Mexicans, Greeks, Turks, Filipinos, Spaniards, Latin Americans, and Negroes may be traced to the use of marijuana. The headlines were anti-drug and anti-crime, but there always was underlining themes: race, addiction, violence, and its effects on children. To further his cause and gain support for his crusade, Anslinger preached that marijuana was a sinister substance that made Mexican and African American men lust after white women. It was these themes that were carried in the media until Congress finally decided to hold hearings about marijuana. Now, one thing to consider was how Anslinger framed what he said about marijuana. Not only did he use specific words that he knew would strike fear in the hearts of Americans, he also used facts and figures as well. For instance, he would say that there were over 100,000 marijuana addicts in the United States. That sounds like a lot. However, the U.S. population in the 1930s was about 120 million people, which was less than 1% of the population. Jazz music became an important target for Anslinger. He believed that it was jazz music that caused white people to experiment with reefers.
Sure uses up the joy wheat, don't they? Well, that's one way of creating business. When they're that age, they're not suspicious and easily hooked.
Reefers was an African-American slang term for marijuana cigarettes and was a common term in popular jazz songs. It was one of the first times that government officials tried to make a connection between pop culture and an observed or suspicious behavior.
Try one of mine. Go ahead, it won't hurt you.
If Anslinger could connect jazz music with an evil marijuana drug epidemic, then he had something to promote. Anslinger's dislike of jazz music was so strong, he even hated certain animated cartoon characters because jazz musicians supplied the soundtrack for popular early cartoons, such as Betty Boop and Popeye the Sailor.
Our hula hula dancer, Betty Boop!
Spinach, Popeye's signature food, was yet another code word for cannabis that jazz musicians used. Popeye gained superhuman strength by sucking a wad of green leaf through his corncob pipe. Jazz musicians and racism also drove the headlines of the Hearst News Syndicate of the 1930s. Headlines such as "Marijuana-crazed madman" became a fixture in the Hearst newspapers, magazines, and radio stations. Reports were being filed that marijuana caused Mexican immigrants to lose their sexual inhibitions, and it was this idea of superhuman sex-craved savages that proved irresistible for politicians and the press. Anslinger found himself at the forefront of public speaking engagements where he made such claims about marijuana such as,
"Take all the good in Dr. Jekyll and the worst in Mr. Hyde. The result is opium. Marijuana may be considered more harmful. It is the Mr. Hyde alone."
These headlines even found their way into the legal system when defense lawyers started using the insanity defense due to marijuana intoxication. Yet, there was little scientific information and only a handful of expert witnesses. One expert witness was Dr. James Munch, a pharmacologist from Temple University. Dr. Munch had conducted tests on dogs and then applied the findings to humans. It was his science that later found its way into the courtrooms and the halls of Congress. While there's no evidence of Anslinger's direct involvement in the earlier films, he was known to capitalize on themes in the media. He wrote books and magazine articles on the dangers of marijuana. One account of marijuana Anslinger wrote about appeared in the American magazine in 1937. This account was included in the film Assassins of Youth. The movie also used other facts and figures that Anslinger had written about. Part of this story Anslinger told will be part of his congressional testimony. The movie also used other facts and figures that Anslinger had written about.
Marijuana dates back as far as 1090 AD. A weed was then called by the Arabic word asheshan, from which we get our English word assassin. During this period, a diabolical, fanatical, cruel, and murderous group living in Syria and Persia committed secret murders in blind obedience to the will of their masters. The heinousness of these crimes aroused all of Europe and Asia. It was their custom that whenever a sheikh required the services of an assassin, a distinctive class known as fetyas were intoxicated with hashish, known to us as marijuana. The weed now, as well as then, is rightly accused of exciting the basest and most criminal tendencies in the minds of its addicts. In one of our prisons, a survey recently made showed that out of 450 persons, 125 were addicts of marijuana, ranging from 18 to 31 years of age. Furthermore, the records of a certain district attorney, taken over the period of the past several years, reveal that in his district, 17 out of 37 of the murderers, 13 out of 145 forgers, 15 out of 125 cases of assault and battery were addicts of marijuana. But I'm afraid that my words will not impress you. So allow me to give you a few scenes that I know will have a lasting impression.
I saw her standing on the 8th-story ledge. She jumped. It's a plain case of suicide, Coroner.
Suicide to most everyone, but to me it's murdered by marijuana.
You murdered 5 people, including your uncle. The weapon was found on you. Why did you do it?
I had a terrible dream. People were trying to hack off my arms. They were sneaking around, trying to kill me. I recognized one. My uncle. I had to kill him. Before they killed me. I had to kill him. Can't you understand? I had to kill him. They killed me unless I kill him. Can't you understand?
This wasn't the only theme the movie developed. The more subtle plot lines dealt with uninhibited sex and marijuana use leading to using other drugs.
I want something stronger. How much have you got? There. Okay. Now don't take those all at once.
Along with Hollywood's fascination with marijuana and the newspaper headlines, there was also a growing women's movement. Similar to the temperance movement of alcohol, women were preaching the evils of marijuana to PTAs across the nation, and they had a lot of influence. Anslinger even had the occasion to meet with PTA members to further his cause.
At the outset of this letter, there is one vital fact I would like to submit. There is a powerful agency. I speak of the school parent associations of this country, which can be invaluable in stamping out this scourge.
So during the trials in the 1930s to pass the Marijuana Tax Act, the testimony that was given in the courtroom was absolutely ludicrous. Everything from marijuana made some young man chop up his family with an axe, to marijuana makes Mexicans go out and try to rape everything in sight, and this was the actual testimony that was given. I mean, it reeks of propaganda. They had no evidence that this was going on. It was basically to instill fear in the hearts of Americans about marijuana so that their states would support making it illegal. And this was very successful. So one of the main people behind this plan was Harry Anslinger, who was the very first drug czar of the United States. And he, besides being this very egocentric man, really wanted to make a name for himself in terms of drug control. So he focused on marijuana, and he used the propaganda that marijuana somehow affected minorities to make them out of control to where white individuals were threatened by their use. And he had all of these quotes about how marijuana makes darkies think they're as good as white men, and how marijuana makes white women fall into the arms of Negroes and jazz musicians and entertainers. And all of this was based around this propagandistic idea that marijuana somehow makes you out of control and violent. And they had absolutely no evidence to support this, but again, because the rest of the country really had no way to investigate these claims, it was very easy for them to accept.
Here is an example. A 16-year-old lad apprehended in the act of staging a holdup. 16 years old and a marijuana addict. Here is a most tragic case. Yes, I remember. Just a young boy. Under the influence of the drug, he killed his entire family with an axe. Then there is the most vicious type of case. Here, in Michigan, a young girl, 17 years old, a reefer smoker, taken in a raid in the company with 5 young men.
When Anslinger testified before Congress, it was like a 3-ring circus, and he was the ringmaster. The most damaging evidence he submitted were quotes from his gore files. There were quotes from newspaper headlines and letters which he claimed were written to him by concerned citizens, politicians, and police officials.
I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of who are low mentally because of social and racial conditions. Harry J. Anslinger.
Here is a particularly flagrant case.
Yes, I remember the newspapers made quite a play of it. In West Virginia, wasn't it?
Yes. And there are hundreds of them coming up, new ones every day.
The congressional hearings were based on testimony Anslinger provided from the newspaper clippings, and Dr. Munch, who had conducted studies on dogs and applied the findings to humans. However, there was a lack of other scientific and medical input. The only study conducted by the U.S. government was not even discussed. The Panama Canal studies were conducted by the Army during the 20s and 30s. American soldiers were given marijuana to smoke, and their behavior was observed. The most notable behavior pattern was sleep and happiness. If marijuana caused violence, it was believed it would show up in these soldiers because they were violent criminals. The other medical testimony that was presented to Congress was given by Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association. Woodward was not popular in Washington because the AMA and Congress had been at odds over Social Security and health care. And after hearing the previous testimony, the doctors started asking embarrassing questions and pointed out inaccuracies within the bill.
That there is a certain amount of narcotic addiction of an objectionable character, no one will deny. The newspapers have called attention to it so prominently that there must be some grounds for their statements. It has surprised me, however, that the facts on which these statements have been based have not been brought before this committee by competent primary evidence. We are referred to newspaper publications concerning the prevalence of marijuana addiction. We are told that the use of marijuana causes crime, but yet no one has been produced from the Bureau of Prisons to show the number of prisoners who have been found addicted to the marijuana habit. An informed inquiry shows that the Bureau of Prisons has no evidence on that point. You have been told that school children are great users of marijuana cigarettes. No one has been summoned from the Children's Bureau to show the nature and extent of the habit among children. Inquiry of the Children's Bureau shows that they have had no occasion to investigate it and know nothing particularly of it. Inquiry of the Office of Education, and they certainly should know something of the prevalence of the habit among the school children of the country, if there is a prevalent habit, indicates that they have had no occasion to investigate and know nothing of it.
Woodward also challenged the proposed bill because he believed the states had adequate laws. He further believed that a medical exception could be provided for marijuana, and marijuana could be added to the Harrison Narcotics Act as well. Woodward also pointed out previous attempts at legislation where the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had made official statements that the states should be responsible for enforcing marijuana control. Woodward also read quotes from the U.S. representative to the League of Nations Advisory Committee on Traffic in Opium and Other Dangerous Drugs. Woodward went on to predict that federal legislation banning marijuana would stop any medical use of the plant. When he finished his testimony, the congressmen ate him alive. They accused him of obstruction, evasion, bad faith, and didn't even bother to thank him. At one point, they even questioned his credentials as both a doctor and a lawyer. The bill reached the floor of the House, and only a few lawmakers were still in the chamber. They managed to wrap up the whole debate in under 2 minutes. There wasn't even a recorded vote on the issue. The final debate went like this. Mr. Snell asked, "Mr. Speaker, does the American Medical Association support this bill?" Committee member Fred Vinson replied, "Their Dr. Wentworth came down here. They support this bill 100%. Of course, Vinson was talking about Dr. Woodward, and that was a flat-out lie.
So the Marijuana Tax Act was passed in 1937, and even though it did not prohibit marijuana exclusively, what it did was say that anybody who was going to sell marijuana or cultivate marijuana needed a special tax stamp from the federal government in order to do so, and the federal government just didn't hand out any stamps. So effectively, marijuana was made illegal by the Marijuana Tax Act.
By this time, the use of cannabis as a medicine had been supplemented or replaced by newer medicines that were water-soluble and could be injected with a hypodermic needle, unlike fat-soluble cannabinoid compounds, which couldn't. The problems of marijuana's insolubility contributed to an early decline in the use of cannabis tinctures. However, marijuana was still listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. In 1961, Anslinger wrote his memoirs, called The Murderers. In his book, he wrote about the early years of marijuana prohibition.
Much of the most irrational juvenile violence that has written a new chapter of shame and tragedy is traceable directly to its hemp intoxication. A gang of boys tears the clothes from two schoolgirls and rape the screaming girls, one boy after the other. A 16-year-old kills his entire family of 5 in Florida. A man in Minnesota puts a bullet through the head of a stranger on the road. In Colorado, a husband tries to shoot his wife, kills her grandmother instead, and then kills himself. Every one of these crimes has been preceded by the smoking of one or more marijuana reefers. As the marijuana situation grows, I knew action had to be taken to get the proper legislation passed. By 1937, under my direction, the Bureau launched 2 important steps. First, a legislative plan to seek from Congress a new law that would place marijuana and its distribution directly under federal control. Second, on a radio and at major forums, such as that presented annually by the New York Herald Tribune, I told the story of this evil weed of the fields and riverbeds and roadsides. I wrote articles for magazines. Our agents gave hundreds of lectures to parents, educators, social and civic leaders. In network broadcasts, I reported on the growing list of crimes, including murder and rape. I also described the nature of marijuana and its close kinship to hashish. I continued to hammer at the facts. I believe we did a thorough job, for the public was alerted and the laws to protect them were passed, both nationally and at the state level. We also brought under control the wild-growing marijuana in this country. Working with local authorities, we cleaned up hundreds of acres of marijuana and we uprooted plants sprouting along the roadsides.
In 1969, the Marijuana Tax Act was declared unconstitutional by unanimous vote of the Supreme Court. It was placed in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 on a temporary basis, where it remains today. However, a new movement has emerged, changing the political landscape. Since 1996, 18 states and the District of Columbia have adopted measures to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. Yet the beginnings of the laws against medical marijuana are based on Harry Anslinger's themes of racism, propaganda, themes such as violence, crime, insanity, use of harder drugs, and sex. The government still maintains the position that marijuana has no medical value to treat disease and views all use as abuse.
Let it be. If you vibrate when your throat gets dry, you know you're high. Everything is standing as you truck on down to